Wow, my pubeb is a buped one. Did the bupeb go pubeb below? We pubeb call bupeb a lot. Are your bupeb to pubeb over there? I see the bupeb here.
No, your earbuds are not broken. That was deliberately onto the left side. This was an experimental stimuli used by today's guest,
Tamar Keren-Portnoy,
and her colleagues at University of York. So once again, I was back home and I decided to hit up the Funky Bunch in the Linguistics department of the University of York. And this time we were looking at first language acquisition.
Bupeb.
Now, there are actually a lot of similarities between learning your first language and learning your second language. So this is definitely worth investigating for language teachers.
Pubeb.
So in this episode, we're going to look at syntax, why babies learn some words earlier than others, how first language acquisition is not mimicking the parent's speech, and how babies make and perceive sounds in their language.
Bupeb here.
And later on in the year, I'm going to release a part 2, a mini episode from this same interview that's based on the stages of development. So if you're interested, you can get to know it a bit better. So without further ado, let's start our interbuped with Tamar. Buped.
Today we're talking about first language acquisition, specifically in babies.
Yes, yeah.
All right. Can you give us a bit of your background first? Like, how did you come to this subject?
Yeah, I did all my studies in Israel and Jerusalem, in a psychology department. But though I went to study psychology to be a clinical psychologist, I ended up finding everything to do with language very interesting. So that's what I mostly studied. I did my PhD on early syntax, so how babies start combining words, very early combinations. And then I went to do a postdoc to change to a new topic. And I found Marilyn Vihman, who also did a blog with you.
Yes, yes.
And she works on babies, which I'd never looked at before.
Okay.
So I came to study with her, do a postdoc with her, and we continued working from then until now. And we really work on very early stages, so between, say, half a year and two and a half is the oldest we look at.
Okay. And after that, they're just too old.
They're too old and uninteresting.
Not interesting.
Yes.
Right. So when you talk about infant syntax, syntax is basic. We could call grammar, sentence structure.
Yeah, sentence structure.
Right. So just out of interest, how is that kind of studied or tested?
So what I did was I recorded, toddlers in their homes, and I wrote down afterwards what they were saying, and so there was no fancy experiment involved at all.
Right.
The main thing that I think is, everything I say today, there will be people who disagree with.
Yeah,
everything,
of course, yeah.
Right? So I looked at how they start combining words around verbs. And what they do is a baby learns to say want with something adjacent to it. So either want milk or something. They usually say their name, so something like Susie want. And that's what they know. Want with the thing you want after it, or my name and want after it. And they both serve to say, give me the thing I'm interested in, either because I point at it or because I say its name. They can't ask you whether you want something. They don't know how to put anybody else, and nobody else wants in this kind of situation. They only they talk about their wanting, right? Later on, they learn that words like want have a little slot after them and a little slot before them for words that the word after is used for the thing you wish to say change possession, and the word before is for the person who is doing it, doing the wanting. And then based on that, they can learn to do other, what we call transitive verbs, right? So transitive verb will have the person who is doing the action in front of it, the name of that person in front of it, the thing that will be transferred after it. So you see that they start with very, very narrow knowledge, right? That's only relevant for one word.
Right. And it's like gap filling almost?
And it's gap filling.
Right.
And then what you can see is that the time that passes from verb number 1 to verb number 2 is very long, but from verb number 2 to verb number 3 it's shorter, and then it's shorter, and then it's shorter. So you see the accumulation of knowledge based on previous knowledge. What you already know teaches you something about the next thing, so the next thing will be easier, and the next thing will be easier, and you see this rising curve in terms of how quickly you gain more and more and more verbs.
Right.
And so you can see that happening for verb with a subject, and verb with an object, and verbs with both, and verbs with the indirect. I mean, as you see, sort of the knowledge accumulating very, very slowly based on usually one or two early verbs that were the ones used intensively in the beginning. You got the point with them, and then you can move on from there on.
Is there a predictable order that this happens in?
Professor Nino, who was my PhD supervisor, looked at what would be the first verbs for different children. She looked at Hebrew and English, and she says that you can't predict exactly, but you can predict there is a very small group of verbs that are likely first verbs, and they usually are very, very general ones, which likely first verbs as combining verbs. Sorry, they would be very general, and she said their main meaning would be. So a transitive verb is a verb of one person doing something on another thing. So the first verb in that kind of structure would be something like make or do or want. The first, if you are talking about ditransitive verbs, so verbs that are like delivery verbs, I give X to Y, which involve a thing being transferred between two animate entities. Yeah?
Right.
These verbs involve transferring. Their first verb almost everywhere would be give or take. So it depends on the direction of movement.
Right.
Verbs that involve only one argument, which are intransitive verbs, usually involve bodily movement, so they'd be go. So you take one really general, go is more general than walk, because walk is going in a certain way, drive is going in a certain way. Go is the most general one.
Right.
That's the one you'd usually encounter first. And she connected that to languages so you can see that these same verbs that are very, very general and sort of their main point is I connect that number of entities in this type of a general activity. These verbs also become prepositions in some languages. So you can see that they change from being a verb to being something else, to being a grammatical marker. They go what is called grammaticalization.
Right.
So you can, based on grammaticalization data, sort of predict which ones will be learned early, or based on learning early, or you can at least connect the two.
Right.
It has to do with just a really general understanding of what kind of sentence I'm building or something like that.
Okay.
One thing that always affects everything is frequency in the input. So the same verbs that are very general tend to undergo grammaticalization and tend to be learned early would be very, very frequent verbs in the speech input to the babies, to the children. So it has to be verbs that they hear a lot from their parents. But you can't just go by, so high frequency is always a good predictor of something being learned early.
Right.
And it's definitely true for this as well. But some things only adults say and some things only children say. So a child won't go to their mother and say, would you like? And they won't say to the mother, don't do that. I mean, there's just kinds of behaviors, admonitions and offering that types of offering that only adults would do to a child, but not the child to the adult.
Okay.
So
it's not mimicking. They're not imitating.
No, because, So we've now looked at input children, much younger children, and some words that are very frequent in adult speech, children don't say. Want is fine because you both hear, you can use it to offer and to demand. But some things which adults would, like an adult can say, are you hungry or are you tired? The child won't tend to say tired or hungry. They tend to say, I think, I want to eat, or, I want milk, or I want to sleep. But they won't sort of talk about their state of being. So we looked at adult speech to babies. I worked with a Lebanese friend of mine on Arabic and Hebrew. Arabic has a word for you want and I want, and they're separate. So want gets an inflection that makes it.
Okay.
So the parents use you want in the second person because they're offering. And the child uses I want in the first person because he's asking for something. So it comes out in Arabic or in Hebrew, it would come out as a different word in some cases. In Hebrew less in this case, but in Arabic it does. Parents say bravo. Children don't say bravo. Children get the bravo. They do something well and then the parent claps or says bravo, but the child doesn't need to say it. So it's things like that make something very frequent in an adult speech that is irrelevant for a child, because the child doesn't need to compliment the parents, for instance.
Okay. Is there any other kind of explanations of how that, whether you can predict which words are used by children, or like how children filter what's important and what's not important?
Probably, but I don't think we haven't reached a point where we're good enough at doing it. So you can say in a sort of fuzzy way that kids there are some things that are important for them or not, something that grab their attention or not. Now, in order to predict it, you need to be able to measure what is important for a child and what attracts their attention. So there are now ways of measuring some of that by, for instance, doing eye tracking. So shall I explain what that is?
Please, yeah.
So there are machines that send the laser into the eye to measure where the
baby.
You can do it with adults as well. It's not
so just laser beams in the eyes of a child.
Yeah, but I think they're very sort of innocuous. What it does is it just checks where the pupil is pointing to, so that it can look to see what you're looking at.
Okay.
And it can be used to measure. You hear a word or you hear a sound to see which thing you're going to be looking at, or it can just be used to see how babies or adults, scan their environment to decide what things to focus on. So there is a guy in the States called Deb Roy, who wired his entire home when he had a baby. All his house, I think, was full of cameras and sound recording equipment.
Wow.
And he recorded his house for about 2 years or something, all the time. He's got zillions of bytes of information from that about one child. But he didn't only record him. I don't know if he also used an eye tracker, but I think using all the information from the different cameras, he can gauge what the child is looking at. And so if you had a group of children wired like that, you could predict, you could build predictions based on, he looked at that for 10 minutes every day. That's the next word he's going to say. Oh, wow. But usually it's we don't have that kind of information.
No.
But we know that that's how it works. What interests the child and the child looks towards. So we know that joint attention is very important. So it's not that everything that happens around the child actually soaks in.
Right.
They soak in what they attend to. So situations with mothers and children doing things or any adult or bigger person doing something with a baby where they both are attending to the same thing and talking about it or playing with it, that's a situation where the baby will learn more because they're attending to the thing. If the baby, so babies who are playing with one thing and the mother or the adult is tending to talk about something else and trying to pull their attention away from it to the thing that the mother or the adult is interested in, that's a situation that's less successful because you have to manage to move the attention of the child from the thing that it's actually now focused on to something else. If you instead follow the baby's attention and attend with them to what they're attending to and talk about that, that's a more fruitful way of getting them to combine, what you're talking about with what they're doing.
So how important is that interaction for language development?
Very. So there is a lot of that's none of my. It's not studies by me at all. I never looked at joint attention, but there are a lot of studies showing that joint attention is really crucial, and there are studies looking at mothers who initiate versus mothers who try to decide what the joint attention is going to be around versus mothers who follow the child's initiative, and I think following the child's initiative is a more successful way of doing it. And in general, sort of being able to be sensitive to what your child is actually interested in at the moment, enjoying that rather than shifting them away from it is a good thing, language or not language, regardless of language.
Right.
There is a famous study done by someone called Pat Kuhl in the States, where she had English-speaking babies playing with a Mandarin speaker, or I think listening to a story told by a Mandarin speaker several days. And then she had them listen to Mandarin sounds, which most babies won't distinguish. They're very similar sounding to people who are not Mandarin speakers by that age, because very, very young babies can tell the differences between sounds that are not, where the differences are not important for their language, but as they near age 10 months or 1 year, they stop being able to do that. Just like us,
Wow.
you know, when I hear two Chinese shh, I can't tell the difference. And Polish sounds are very, you know, you hear, they have about 3, 4, I don't know how many different kinds of shs and chs. They all sound the same to me.
Right.
They don't sound the same to them. So that difference between what is in your native language and what isn't starts very early. Around age 1, you lose the capacity to distinguish between sounds that are very close in your language but distinct in another language. It's not true for everything, but it's true for many things. Anyway, so she exposed these kids to Mandarin without, they really didn't know what they were being talked to about, but they had an interaction with an adult speaking Mandarin. And after a few weeks, these kids could tell these sounds apart, whereas kids who didn't hear a Mandarin speaker couldn't. But in addition, she had another group who were exposed to Mandarin via television. So the same kind of interactions was taking part on TV, not with a real person. And these kids also couldn't, they didn't sort of become sensitive to the Mandarin distinction. So she said clearly the social aspect of learning is very important. Now, in addition, it's absolutely true. I'm sure she's right. But the other side to it is that probably when you play a TV for a baby, and it's not interesting, they just don't listen.
Okay.
So it must be something social, something about the social connection, which also helps attention. And if you just play a TV in the background, there's no attention and there's no social... The social aspect, I think, mostly makes it pleasant, you know, enjoyable. It gives you motivation and it helps with the attention wrapping of the situation.
Interesting. So that, again, it's that face-to-face interaction.
Yeah. Someone smiling at you when you do something that makes you feel good about yourself, you know, there is sort of a rewarding going on there, and just people need people, you know, there is something nice about being with somebody else and doing something with them.
Right.
And in addition, it makes you attend to what we're doing together, which you probably don't do when something is done in the background. You just treat it as background and you log it out.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. You sometimes hear mothers, like with babies who can't even speak yet, almost having a play conversation where they will leave gaps for an answer and then continue as if there's been an answer. Yeah. So it's almost, would that be like training the brain almost to...
I don't think they do it for that.
Oh, I mean, but
I think that's
what's going on.
Yeah, so what babies learn really, really early is about turn-taking, which is just what you just described. So they learn that one person does some talking, and then I do some talking, and then the other person does some talking, and then I do, you know, that you do it in turns. And I don't know about cross-linguistic studies about that, but there might be. But probably in different cultures, you come in at different points. So in England, you wait until the other person finished. In Israel, you would never think of waiting. You'd always butt in before they finished, once you know what they're saying. Because why wait?
So when you can predict the end, you just jump straight in.
Yes. And I think there are just, you know, these acoustic cues. And so something like, I'm nearing my end, I'm going to, you know, my pitch will start to drop a little bit or something like that. And when I give that cue, the other person knows that they can butt in.
They can just stop.
And when I came to England, it was very, very hard for me, it still is, to learn not to butt in, because that's, you know, I think you learn it as a baby. So it's very, very hard to relearn something else when you're an adult.
Right. Again. So you mentioned about babies like soaking up language. So I think kind of the popular conception from people who haven't studied is that babies are sponges and they just absorb language. Like, to what extent is that true?
It's true to a large extent. I mean, they're born not knowing it, and they are then, by age 1, they start doing something that sounds like it. So the question maybe isn't whether they soak. They definitely soak. One question is whether they soak everything, and the answer is probably they soak mostly the things that they can either that they're either attending to, or that are complex to such a degree that they can handle them. So things that are too complex, either too long and difficult, or too strange and they've never heard won't make much an impression, and things that they've heard many times, and maybe things that are short, things that are loud, things that are repeated get learned more. So there isn't some system to what gets soaked in first or what gets soaked in later. In addition, this is again a minority opinion to some extent, what we think is also very important is the child itself. So, children are born with a brain with connections in the brain right from the start. They're there. They already hear some sounds in the womb. So they have familiarity with at least the sort of the rhythm and the music of the language spoken around them at birth.
Wow, okay.
So you can if you play two very different languages to them, one that they heard from the womb and one that sounds very, very different rhythmically, they can tell that at birth.
Wow.
So something they've learned already, which means that when they're born, already some of the wiring has been affected by things they've learned before that connected to other things they've learned before. So no two brains at birth are the same. They're probably not the same even before that, because nothing is the same as anything. But already they're affected by some learning. And so there is importance to what the organism itself, the baby, has done before. It will affect the way that it's going to learn from now on. So one thing that we think is really important is what babies do in terms of motor stuff, like their movement teaches them how to move. When there's a lovely, lovely paper called Travel Broadens the Mind, which is about what babies gain from starting to move on their own. So when we carry babies around, one thing that happens is that the world shifts perspective for them all the time. Sometimes they see things from the back, sometimes they move in the direction they're looking at, sometimes they move away from the direction they're looking at, sometimes they're sideways, sometimes they're upside down.
Right.
When they're lying in their crib and people come to them, they see faces from all kinds of directions, because you don't always come to them like this,
right,
face, and right up both our faces. Sometimes you're above them, sometimes you're to the side of them. So they get things from very many different angles.
Right.
Once they start to move themselves, either by crawling or by walking with a walker, then for the first time, they look in the direction that they're moving. And that teaches them a lot about perspective, about things growing as you move towards them and getting, and things moving to the sides as you go through the middle and all kinds of things like that. And also, they learn about three-dimensionality in terms of depth, because it's the first time that they can fall. So they learn that when things suddenly, when you have this break and size changes, it's dangerous. All kinds of things like that they learn just from moving, and they won't learn it before. And it's not got to do with, it's harder to learn otherwise. It's not impossible, but it's harder. So, and we know that it's not about motoric maturation, because a lot of the effects happen with babies that are put in walkers, rather than just babies who crawl on their own. So it's not about how strong your muscles are in your leg, but just the fact that you are responsible to where you're looking and where you're moving towards. So the same thing, we think, probably happens to some extent with speech. So a baby babbles or makes all kinds of sounds. There are some random issues there about what you did with your tongue. Was that a fun thing to do with your tongue? Shall I do it again? Did it make a nice sound? Let's do that one again. Different babies will babble with make more of different noises based on some random chance things that happened in their history, which made them do this gesture more or that gesture more. So that means that one baby will be an expert at b, and one baby will be an expert at d, and one baby will be an expert at s, although that's quite rare. So there are some sounds you hear a lot. You hear a lot ba 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 da da da.
Yeah.
You hear less sa, but some babies do them. More maybe sa with the tongue out, because it's easier to control that gesture than doing a real S. That means that whatever sound so different babies will have different histories, and these are probably random things that just happened. You happen to wag your tongue in a different way or play with your lips in a certain way and got these sounds out. Then that will affect what sounds familiar to you when you hear other people speak. So if you're a B baby, you hear people say a lot of B words, that sort of jumps at you. You say, I know that one. I do it, So you get sort of more of, we call it salience. The sounds you make grab your attention more when you hear them than sounds you don't make at first. Later on, maybe the balance between the sounds you know because you make them and the sounds you haven't made changes a little bit, and suddenly the sounds that you don't make are more interesting and they grab your attention more. So we've run a study of that kind where we recorded babies, we checked which sounds they do or don't make, and had them listen to passages filled with non-words that either had sound A they make or sound B that they don't make much. Babies who only had one sound that they could make a lot, who had B but nothing else, listened to the B passage. So we had a passage going like,
"Wow, my pubep is a buped one. Did the bupeb go pubep below? We pubep call bupeb a lot. Are your bupeb to pubep over there? I see the bupeb here."
So it was just junk words, but they were full of this B sound. So babies who were just starting to settle on a sound, who had one sound, would listen to the passage with the sound that they had. Babies who already had two different sounds were actually interested in the sound that they didn't have. And it was quite a strong difference between these two groups.
Wow.
So the main message from that kind of a study is babies do learn a lot from what they hear, but they learn a lot from what they say or what they make. So some of the learning is done based on what I've done before. It changes the way I listen, then it changes the way I soak new things in, because I listen more to the things that are interesting to me, and part of what makes something interesting to me is what I've done before. So it's sort of like a feedback loop, between the things you output and the things that you intake then afterwards.
I guess one question probably a lot of people are wondering is, in these tests, how do you know what a baby's listening to?
So what we did in this test is, first I told you we identified what the babies say. That's easy, you just record them. Now we have a setup in the lab here, which is called a head. We have several ways of testing, but the simplest thing to do is you put a baby in a dark, boring room, and you have either. Okay, the easiest one is, it's called a head turn. You have a loudspeaker on the right hand side and a loudspeaker on the left hand side. And there's nothing to look at, but near each loudspeaker there is a flashing light. And when the light flashes, the baby looks to that side, and then we start playing something from the loudspeaker. And the babies, so any animate creature, when you flash a light on its peripheral, in the periphery of their vision, they'll turn to it, because, it might be a predator or something.
Right.
So we turn, okay. So the baby turns, then there is nothing to look at, but the flashing light is not interesting, but there is some sound, some speech coming from that direction. And the babies, while they attend to the speech, they look towards it. Not because they see anything, but just because I think when we listen, we tend to look towards the sound. When they stop finding it interesting, they turn away. And so we play sound type A, ones from the right, ones from the left, randomly. Sound type B, ones from the right, ones from the left, randomly. Several times like that. And somebody sits outside and watches the baby through a video and presses a button. As long as the baby's looking to the right, you press the right button, lift your finger. As long as they look to the left, you press the left button, lift your finger when they stop. And you can learn a lot about what babies can or can't do. So what this method allows you to do is say, did the baby distinguish between them? Did they find one more interesting than the other, or one more attention grabbing than the other?
Right.
If they did, you'll see a difference between looks to A and looks to B. But it tells you then what babies can distinguish, what they consider to be similar and what they consider to be different. And in this case, we could tell that they were listening more to type A, to their own sound or to the other sound, and could connect that to what they came with from home.
Right. Very interesting. I think I'd read some research somewhere about like a pacifier
sucking,
or
yes.
a dummy that they suck faster if they're interested.
Yeah, you can do it. That's with younger babies than the ones we look at. So I said we start 6 months old. 6 months old, you test with a head turn.
Okay.
The sucking technique is suitable for newborns, and I think maybe up to 3 months. I'm not sure up to what age. And they suck more intensively when something is interesting or exciting to them.
Okay.
But I've never used it, so I don't know how difficult it is to use. I think you get more, you lose more babies that don't work out or cry or something. But maybe because, I'm not sure it's the method, it's probably because they're very young. Head turns, we also have, so whenever you work with babies, the question is how difficult the task is. The harder it is to train them on it, the more likely you are to lose participants on the way.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. That was really, really fascinating.
Oh, great.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.